So this is no surprise to anyone who knows me very well. I'm a big crier. I know not everyone here is. However, this past year brought a lot of tears. The horrifying day of October 7th, that morning, I'm sure you all remember it. I raged. I mean, really raged. Like screaming and crying. I remember lying in my backyard, literally on the ground. I needed to touch the earth to stabilize myself, as if the land were uncontrollably shaking. Similar how I acted after the 1994 Northridge earthquake. And then I fell into a pattern. I'd wake up every morning for months. I'd walk into the bathroom where I kept my cell phone, and I'd start scrolling and crying. Every day, every single morning, waking up crying over the horrendous murders of children, Holocaust survivors, peace activists, Jews, non-Jews alike, even two of our own Temple Israel Briskin graduates, Roya and Nurel Manzouri, who were murdered on that day with their fiancé, Amit Cohen, gunned down in a bunker after being at the Nova Festival. I don't wish that crying on anyone. It's raw, it's unedited, it's from the depths of our gut. And I continue to cry. I sat down with my friend Aziza Hassan, who's here today, the director of New Ground, the Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change. She's a Palestinian-American woman. And we were sitting at a diner together, and she told me that one of her friends had suffered the death of 100 people in her immediate family, killed in Gaza. They say in Hebrew, ein milim, no words. And then months later, I spoke to an Israeli friend of mine, a colleague who made Aliyah, and he told me that he told me that his son is scheduled to go to 37 memorials that week. Ein milim, no words. And then months later, Aziza and I spoke again, and we both felt like stuck in the compounding loss of life in Israel and Gaza on both sides of the war, shaking our heads at what seemed to be an impossible road to peace between two traumatized people. And I shed tears again when she shared how devastating it was when she chose to tour the Nova exhibit that was right here in Culver City. And she was sickened to hear her holy Muslim call to prayer shouted by terrorists as they butchered Jews. It was sick. And then my heart breaks again, because I am a Zionist, and I also believe that Zionism today needs to be reworked and revisioned for the next generation, or I fear we will lose all legitimacy, not only in the world's views, but in our own children's eyes. Now, I'm not going to make this sermon all about Israel. Mari did that yesterday. But one last story. In February, I visited in Israel another Israeli friend, a psychologist, who said to me, even though I know intellectually I should have sympathy toward the Gazans, I have none. Absolutely none. This is the world we're living in. This morning, I want to explore crying with you. Now, don't worry, I don't want to make you cry. That's actually not my goal. And when Shelley was just singing Avinu Malkeinu, I was tearing up, and I said to myself, pull yourself together, Michelle, because you have a sermon to give right now. But it's been a hard year, a year leading to a lot of crying. And crying can sometimes be the most honest, raw expression of what it means to be human. A fact, only humans, we are the only mammals on earth who shed tears. So given that our mission these next 9 days is to engage in a cheshbon hanefesh, an examination of our souls, Maimonides advises that the repentant needs to constantly, he says, cry out in prayer to God, weeping and pleading for God's forgiveness. And you might think to yourself, God, really? I don't even know what it would feel like to break down in front of God, to get on my knees and to open my soul to whoever may be listening. I hear you. I hear you. Rabbi Hanina, who lived in poverty at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, he taught, even when we feel like the gates of prayer are closed, the gates of tears are never closed. So I don't want to make this sermon a downer. And I also know that we cry for many, many reasons, right? So how many of you here watch the Summer Olympics? Any part of the Summer Olympics? Oh, that's a lot. That's like the majority of us. So I know a person who cried while watching the artistic swimming people compete. Seriously. The mystery, the mastery, the passion, the precision was so inspiring that she cried. And I know another person who came out of surgery, and he was so appreciative of all the doctors and the nurses and the staff and everyone who helped in the surgery, getting him through surgery, that he shed tears of gratitude. And maybe you watched Saturday Night Live skit last Saturday night. I watched it after Slichot, just want to let everyone know. It was so funny. I know someone who was crying because he was laughing so hard. And then there are the moments of sacred joy, right? Watching a grandchild perform in a play, or sitting by the ocean and watching dolphins fly high, or being held by a power that's beyond us. It's those existential moments that sometimes crack our eyes open with water. And there are also emotionally painful times. I know a person who cried when their child separated from their spouse, or a person who cried out of frustration because she loves so deeply and for a variety of reasons can't realize her love. Or a man who's breaking from the pain because all he wants is to be physically held by his wife and to hold her gaze, and she just can't give it to him. And of course, there are moments we cry due to physical pain, overwhelming stress, and debilitating loneliness. And yet, I also know that not everyone's a crier. We bring a lot of baggage to the table when it comes to crying. Crying challenges supposed gender norms. And sometimes we come up against cultural expectations or family expectations. Or maybe we fear losing control. Or maybe we're concerned we'll be judged by our productivity. And those fears aren't crazy. Some even argue that tears are manipulative, like when spouses accuse one another of tears in order to manipulate their partner to do something or to change in some way. And honestly, we Jews use tears after 400 years of slavery. It was only when we started crying out to God that God listened. So, okay, let's own it. Tears can be manipulative. And also, tears have been used by some men to assume that women can't hold positions of leadership in government or business, hence the word hysterical, right? Hysterical comes from the Greek hysterokos, which means suffering from the womb, because of their fluctuating hormones that make them unstable. So here's what I have to say about that. When men start menstruating, giving birth, nursing, and going through menopause, then we'll talk. Meanwhile, it seems as though women are doing more than just a fine job. Okay, so tears can be loaded. And it's not surprising that Jewish texts have a lot to say about tears and crying. So today I'd like to do a type of study with you through some of those texts, and then on Yom Kippur we'll go even more deeply. We'll look at some Torah, Talmud, Midrash, and you can find some of those texts in front of you. So the first thing, it's not on your sheets. The first thing I do want to point out is, who are the two biggest criers in the whole Torah? The two biggest criers in the whole Torah are Joseph and King David. I will point out two men, just saying. So King David cries a total of 6 times. 6 times in the Torah. And sometimes they're very tender moments, like when he's parting from his beloved Jonathan, he cries. But there are other times where it's a little iffy what his tears are doing, like when his son Absalom is killed, and he says, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, if only I would have died instead of you." Yeah, well, the readers are sort of like raising their eyebrows, because we all know that Absalom rebelled against his dad and tried to steal the throne. And so we sort of wonder, was that, all political talk? How genuine was it? But earlier in the Torah, we meet the second crier. The second crier in the whole Torah is Esau. Esau cries when his twin steals the birthright from him instead of him, and steals the blessing more accurately. And he says in anguish, he cries out, "Bless me too, Father." He even comes up with a solution. He says, "Don't you have a blessing for me too?" Hint, hint. And it's pathetic. It's pathetic that Isaac can't even fake compassion. Isaac stammers, "What should I do for you?" And flabbergasted, Esau begs, as if he has to teach his father how to parent. "Have you but one blessing, Father? Bless me too, Father." And then Esau wept aloud. From shock to anger to criticism to pleading. And they weren't just silent tears, but they were tears with sound. The Hebrew says kolo. Esau cries out loud with a voice. And what's so upsetting is that his fevered release doesn't change anything. So here we have David, the political manipulator, and we have Esau, the irate child who's unloved. And now, by the way, who is the very first person in the Torah to cry? Come on, you were all at services yesterday, you know. Who is the first person in the Torah to cry? Hagar. Okay. So Hagar is a non-Jewish woman, right? We read the story yesterday, but I'll review it because it seems as though it's not at the tip of your tongue. All right. So Abraham and Sarah are married. They can't have a kid. Sarah says to Abraham, why don't you sleep with my handmaid Hagar? He says, okay. He sleeps with her. They have a child, Ishmael. Then, lo and behold, Sarah gets pregnant. She then has a kid, Isaac. Then she's not very happy that Ishmael is in her home, and she doesn't want to share the inheritance. And so she turns to Abraham and asks him to do her dirty work and kick out Hagar and Ishmael from the house. Now, follow along in your sheets. Verse 14. I'm not going to read exactly, okay? I'm going to paraphrase. So they're thrown out, verse 14, with some bread and water. But soon the water runs out, verse 15. And remember, this is the desert, right? And Hagar is a single parent. And so she is likely distraught. And so she places her son Ishmael, who, by the way, is never named with his name. He's only called the boy or him or the slave person's kid. It reminds me of someone from the debates who kept on referring to her as she and her, right? Same thing. That's what our Torah does to Ishmael in this chapter, by the way. So she places him far away because she doesn't want to, look at verse 16, she doesn't want to witness her son's death. And some commentators, by the way, criticize her for this, like, oh, what a bad mother. But I actually have a lot of empathy for Hagar, that when we as mothers are powerless, it's often painful to see our children suffer. So once he is placed far away from her, look at that. She bursts into tears. But Hagar's tears are not meant to be manipulative like King David, and they're not irate like Esau. Instead, her tears are drenched in hopelessness, helplessness, and shock. I can imagine her sitting there saying, really? This is how my life is going to end, and I can't do anything about it? This year, we're all Hagar. Unlike King David and Esau, Hagar's tears actually do change the trajectory of the narrative. Look at what happens. Go to verse 17. So God notices the boy crying and tells Ishmael, don't worry about it. Ishmael's going to become a great nation, verse 18. And then, look what happened, verse 19. Hagar's eyes are opened, and she sees a well of water, and she saves her son from the brink of death. By the way, could the water have been there the whole time? I don't know, maybe. Sort of like the ram caught in the thicket. Maybe it was there the whole time. Not quite sure. But now, after her tears, she sees. And something shifts. It says in Hebrew, Vayifkach Elohim et einav, and Hagar's eyes opened. Now, that's not the normal, usual word that we use for opening. It's a different word, and it's the same verb that we see in the Garden of Eden with with Adam and Eve. And it's the verb that has to do with opening, that sees renewed vision and hope and possibility. So if this year we're all Hagar, how can our tears help us see differently? This last Midrash and Talmud teaching on the top of page 2 might help us think differently about how we can use our tears. So first of all, here's the setting. It's based on a verse you can see from Lamentations. In Hebrew, it's called Eicha. And it's from the beginning of Eicha, the beginning of Lamentations, where the temple is destroyed. The Jews are kicked out of the land of Israel. And we read this verse, Bachu tivko balayla. And you can see, even if you don't read the Hebrew, you can see that it's said double. Cry, she will cry at night. Okay? So the Talmud answers, why does it say cry twice? Okay, they give a nice little reason, which is, well, the first cry is for the destruction of the first temple, and the second cry is for the destruction of the second temple. And why does it say at night? It says at night because it refers back to Numbers chapter 14, where the Jews cried at night, and we cry at night. Okay, lovely. Not very satisfying. So, Leora Ayalon, she is an 8th generation Jerusalemite. She's just a woman just like you and me. And she's an author and a poet. And in the book Darshoni, which is a collection of women's midrashim from the land of Israel, she submitted this midrash. And she says, no. The reason why it says cry, you will cry at night, the reason why it says cry twice is because crying is a command. We are commanded to cry. One must notice one's neighbor's sorrow. And that when we do that, we lift a little of their sorrow. And why does it say at nighttime? Leora teaches because at night, people are left alone with their grief. And their neighbor should cry with them at night so that the weeping is shared. Beautiful teaching, right? Leora is saying, first of all, we're commanded to cry. The sorrow of the world is our business. And second, it's isolating. Crying is isolating, and we need to go out of our way to find those who are in pain. Bottom of page 2. Now I'm going back to Talmud. This is the same Talmud teaching on the cry, you will cry at night, right? So then the Talmud tells this really interesting story about Rabbi Gamliel. So there was a woman who was Rabbi Gamliel's neighbor, whose son died. And she, the mom, would cry for her son at night. And Rabbi Gamliel heard her voice and cried along with her until his eyelashes fell out. And so the next day, his students took note and removed her from the neighborhood. I mean, sort of a shocking teaching in the Talmud, right? He was doing everything that the Talmud just said we were supposed to do, which is cry with other people, right? But so why did they take her out of the neighborhood? So the Talmud says, oh, well, because, he was crying and she caused so much pain to him. But look at what Leora Ayalon does. She says that he was crying. His eyelashes fell out because he was crying alone. His neighbors didn't hear him crying. And so the students actually removed her from the neighborhood not to punish her, but to send her out into the world, going from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood. And then look at what she says. So her voice would be like a shofar, and that her voice and her crying would sound from one end of the earth to another. And so Rabbi Gamliel will not be alone when he cries, because all the people of the community, all the communities will then cry with him, and sorrow will be diminished, and the tears will cleanse everyone's souls. What a beautiful teaching, right? Essentially, the Talmudic traditional teaching blames the woman, and she's saying, no, it was actually the students that were taking the woman out into the world and having her cry like a shofar, so we could all be affected and we could in some way lift that pain. So this year, I wonder what would happen if each of us felt a little uninhibited, a little less inhibited, to tear up during tefillah, during prayer. Maybe Avinu Malkeinu, maybe Unatana Tokef, maybe the shofar. And might our collective crying lift some of our pain? And if tears aren't accessible to you, or not just where you're at right now, what would it feel like to honor the tears that you yourself had cried earlier this year, or others have cried? So here's what we're going to do, and I'm actually serious, and I'm giving you warning. Later, when we hear the shofar, before the very last Tekiah Gedolah, I'm going to invite all of us to unlock either our own crying or our neighbors' crying or the crying of the pain of the world. Think about it. Nowadays, there are so few public places where we can scream or moan or cry. And how are we going to do that? Bottom of page 3 on your sheets. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, he was trying to teach his students in the 1700s how to pray. And he suggested that they put away all the fancy erudite prayers, and all they do is simply pray one word of truth. One word of truth from their heart. So imagine if each of us picked one word of truth from your heart today. It could be a word like heal, stop, fear, gratitude, please, love, yes, no, help. What would your word for this year be? Find it. Find it, and when we get to the Tekiah Gedolah, we're going to take a breath, and we're going to cry out those words in a cacophony of voices. And when we cry those words together with our neighbors, we will weep with one another, and no one will be alone. For our last set of shofar blows, it's going to be time for you to cry out your words soon. So think about that word. It could be why, it could be no, it could be yes, it could be how come, please help me. And before Tekiah Gedolah, we're going to take a breath, we're going to scream out our words, and then we'll call it Tekiah Gedolah.
Tekiah, Shivarim Trua. Tekiah. Tekiah. Shvarim. Tekiah. Tekiah. Teruah.
Okay, take a deep breath in and cry out your word. Whoa! Tekiah Gadola.